Did ancient Israelites worship the Ark of the Covenant? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and I wanted to share this post, which I recently came across on Twitter. And the image is a James Tissot painting that depicts Moses and Aaron bowing down and worshiping before the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle. And this was shared by that Catholic guy who says, wait till you discover the Old Testament. And that was shared in response to another tweet where somebody posted a photo of Catholics bowing down and worshiping before a statue of Mary. And that post was obviously condemning Catholic adoration of Mary. That Catholic guy was suggesting, hey, they did the same thing regarding the Ark of the Covenant. And then this was retweeted by Danny, who says nobody was worshiping the Ark. They were worshiping God, who was present at the Ark. This is such a terrible attempt at idolatry justification. Now, the reality is this is a distinction without a difference. The notion that they were worshiping God who was present at the ark and not the ark itself is the very logic of divine images, or what people call idolatry, because that was what influenced all ancient use of material objects to facilitate communion with the divine, communication with the divine, and worship of the divine. In other words, they all knew that the material objects were not in and of themselves the deities they were worshiping. They knew that they were simply indexing the deity, and if the proper rituals were done and the proper materials were used, then that piece of material media, that material object, would become inhabited by, or would in some way manifest or reify or bear the presence and the agency and the authority and the power of the deity. And so they knew they weren't worshiping a rock or a piece of gold or a piece of clay. They knew that that was just a channel to worship the deity that it indexed. So this is a distinction without a difference. The ancient Israelites did the exact same thing with the Ark of the Covenant. And you can look at the narratives regarding the Ark of the Covenant in the Hebrew Bible, and as long as you recognize the diachronic development in Ark theology, you can see that it moves from a shrine model that houses miniature divine images, which I think is what most likely the tablets of the law were, down to the notion that it was a throne and that God simply sat on the throne. And some people will try to distinguish it, say, no, God wasn't in the ark, God was on the ark. Again, a distinction without a difference, because in the ancient world they would sometimes worship like bulls or other animals that they knew were pedestal animals, where when they represent the deity associated with the animal, they have the deity standing on top of the animal. But the animal still functions as the divine image because it bears the presence, the agency, the authority, the power of the deity. So what they did in ancient Israel with the Ark of the Covenant, or with Nehushtan, with the bronze serpent, is no different from idolatry. What changed? Well, they renegotiated the appropriate material media for facilitating divine presence. No longer were the standing stones or the statues or the Ark of the Covenant or the Nehushtan appropriate material media. It moved to texts, and the text of the law became the only appropriate material media for presencing or manifesting the presence of the deity. And they misrepresented what idolatry was. The anti-idol polemics of Jeremiah and Isaiah and others misrepresented the logic of divine images by suggesting the Babylonians actually believed the stone or the gold or the wood was divine in and of itself. The authors of those anti-idol polemics knew better. They knew that they understood those divine images in precisely the same way that ancient Israel understood the Ark of the Covenant. But they misrepresented it to demonize and to vilify their use of those divine images. Meanwhile, they renegotiated their own understanding, and the text of the law became the only appropriate material media for manifesting God's presence because it bore the divine name. And we see this in the use of the mezuzot. We see this in the use of phylacteries in later Judaism. We see this in a variety of ways. And I've actually written an entire book on this. It's called Adonai's Divine Images, a Cognitive Approach, where I start by developing a theoretical model for how divine agency works, and therefore how divine images worked in the ancient world, and how the Hebrew Bible is full of divine images that manifested the presence of Adonai, and the Ark of the Covenant was one of those divine images. And something that gets developed later on is the idea of actual living, breathing, sentient, anthropomorphic beings functioning as divine images. We actually see this originally with the idea that humanity was created as a divine image because humanity represented God, and humanity could bear God's presence and power and authority. And this all gets consolidated many centuries later in the figure of Jesus Christ, who people worshipped not because he was God, but because he bore God's presence, and because God is at Jesus Christ. Just like, according to Danny, they weren't worshiping the Ark of the Covenant, they were worshiping God who was present at the Ark. Why? Because the Ark manifested God's presence. So it is all the logic of divine images. It is all, if you want to use a pejorative term, idolatry. We just decided we would renegotiate what we considered appropriate idolatry and what we considered inappropriate idolatry. And everything that we did was appropriate idolatry. Everything everybody else did was inappropriate idolatry. So to answer the question, did ancient Israelites worship the Ark of the Covenant? Yes. Or you could also just say they worship God through the Ark of the Covenant, just like people worship God through Jesus Christ, who is functioning precisely as a divine image. And the fit for this video is the army of darkness.